In April 2003, General Motors sent flatbed trucks to repossess working electric cars from drivers who didn't want to give them back. The drivers had organized. They held vigils outside the GM facility. They pooled funds and offered to buy every vehicle outright, cash, full price, no negotiation required. GM refused. The cars were loaded, transported to a facility in Fontana, California, and crushed into scrap, every single one. The official press statement said the program had been discontinued due to lack of consumer demand. That was the public record. The documented record shows something else entirely. There were memos. There were lobbying contracts. There were patent transfers worth tens of millions of dollars. And there was a battery technology that an oil company acquired the rights to and then buried. The paper trail exists. Most people never followed it. If that interests you, subscribe, because this channel covers what most people slept through. To understand what was killed in 2003, you need to understand what existed in 1996. In September of that year, General Motors launched the EV1, the first mass-produced electric vehicle from a major American automaker, not a concept car, not a prototype shown at an auto show and quietly shelved. A working vehicle leased directly to consumers in California and Arizona, serviced through Saturn dealerships, supported by a dedicated maintenance infrastructure. The EV1 was fast. The first-generation model reached 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 9 seconds, comparable to a mid-range sports car of the era. It was quiet. It had a range of 60 to 70 miles on a single charge. For the vast majority of American daily commutes, which averaged under 30 miles at the time, that range was more than sufficient. The second generation, released in 1999, used nickel metal hydride batteries, a more advanced chemistry than the original lead-acid cells. Range extended to over 100 miles. Charging times improved. The car was evolving on exactly the trajectory you would expect from a first-generation technology given continued investment and development. Drivers loved them. Waiting lists formed. The consumer base that emerged was educated, affluent, and motivated. Doctors, engineers, academics, early adopters. Many of them attempted to buy their vehicles outright. GM's lease agreements included no purchase option. That decision had been made deliberately at the program design stage. The EV1 did not emerge from a spontaneous act of corporate vision by General Motors. It emerged from regulation. In 1990, the California Air Resources Board, CARB, passed the zero-emission vehicle mandate. It required that 2% of all vehicles sold in California by model year 1998 must produce zero emissions at the tailpipe. That threshold was set to rise, 5% by 2001 and 10% by 2003. California represented the largest single automobile market in the United States. For automakers, compliance was not optional. GM chose to comply with purpose. The company invested approximately $1 billion in the EV1 program across its development lifespan, roughly $1.6 billion in today's dollars. It retooled a manufacturing facility in Lansing, Michigan. It partnered with Hughes Aircraft, later absorbed into Delco Electronics, to develop the power management and charging systems. It trained a dedicated technical workforce. This was not a token. It was a serious product from the largest automaker in the world. It worked. It had real users. It had a development path. At the same time, across the country, the American Petroleum Institute, the primary lobbying organization for the U.S. oil and gas industry, had begun monitoring California's mandate explicitly. Internal API communications from the mid-1990s characterized the ZV regulation as a direct threat to petroleum consumption volumes. The analysis was straightforward. If battery electric vehicles achieved anything approaching the scale California was mandating, liquid fuel demand from personal transportation would begin to decline. That analysis was correct. The API's response was to fund a campaign to prevent it. The documentation of that spending runs into the tens of millions of dollars. The paper trail begins in 1995. It does not end cleanly. The most important document in this story is not a lobbying disclosure. It is a patent transfer. In 1994, General Motors had acquired a 60% controlling stake in Ovonic Battery Company, a firm founded by inventor Stanford Ovchinsky in Troy, Michigan. Ovchinsky had developed the nickel-metal hydride battery chemistry that would become the standard for high-performance, rechargeable applications throughout the 1990s and 2000s. NiMH batteries were more thermally stable, longer-lasting, and more energy-dense than the lead-acid cells that powered the EV1's first generation. They were, at the time, the most promising technology available for large-format electric vehicle applications. Through Ovonic, GM controlled the core patents on that technology. As long as GM held those patents, the technology remained within the automotive industry, subject to the same commercial logic, the same development incentives, the same competitive pressures as any vehicle program. In 2000, as part of a broader restructuring of its non-core assets, GM sold its stake in Ovonic Battery Company to Texaco. The stated rationale was strategic refocusing. The reported sale price was approximately $30 million. In 2001, Chevron Corporation completed its acquisition of Texaco for $45 billion, one of the largest oil mergers in U.S. history at the time. With that acquisition, Chevron inherited the Ovonic NiMH battery patents. Chevron exercised those patents through a subsidiary it controlled called Cobasys. Within 2 years of the acquisition, Cobasys had declined to license large-format nickel-metal hydride battery technology to any electric vehicle manufacturer. The licensing terms it did offer were structured to make commercial e-wave applications economically unviable. The documented consequence was immediate. Toyota had been manufacturing the RAV4 EV, a battery-electric SUV using NiMH packs sourced from Panasonic EV Energy, a joint venture that relied on the Ovonic technology. When Cobasys moved to restrict licensing, Toyota's supply of those battery packs was constrained and eventually cut off. Production of new RAV4 EV units halted. The remaining inventory sold out. Toyota ceased production. This is not a disputed allegation. It is documented through patent office filings, licensing dispute records, and a legal settlement reached in 2010 in which Cobasys, by then acquired by SB Lemotive, a Samsung and Bosch joint venture, settled with affected manufacturers without admitting liability. The settlement terms were not publicly disclosed. The battery technology that had extended the EV1's range, that had proven viable in real-world fleet use, that represented the clearest development path toward affordable mass-market electric vehicles, was now controlled by an oil company subsidiary. That subsidiary declined to make it available on terms that would allow the technology to compete. Simultaneously, the lobbying effort against California's ZV mandate was intensifying through legal channels. In 1996, a coalition of automakers, including GM, Ford, and Chrysler, alongside the Western States Petroleum Association and the American Petroleum Institute, filed legal challenges against CARB's mandate. The suits argued the regulation was technically infeasible, that the consumer market did not support the vehicles, and that the state had exceeded its regulatory authority. The litigation was coordinated. Internal communications disclosed through discovery showed consistent messaging alignment between the automakers and the oil lobby. The narrative, no consumer demand, technology not ready, infrastructure insufficient, was developed through coalition and delivered consistently across press, regulatory proceedings, and congressional testimony. In 1999, the California Fuel Cell Partnership was formed. Its founding members included General Motors, Ford, Daimler Chrysler Shell, BP, and Texaco. The stated mission was to develop hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as the zero-emission solution for California roads. The projected commercial timeline was 2010 to 2015. The partnership positioned hydrogen as the credible, permanent path forward. Battery electric vehicles were reframed in regulatory filings, in communications to CARB, in media, as an immature short-term workaround. The effect was not to advance hydrogen. The effect was to delay the battery mandate. Every year spent studying hydrogen was a year the ZV requirement could be contested, weakened, or overturned. The public story was simple. Electric vehicles had failed the market test. GM's official communications in 2001 and 2002 consistently stated that the EV1 program was being wound down for commercial reasons. Consumer demand had not materialized at the scale necessary to justify continued investment. The technology, while promising, remained too limited in range, charge time, and infrastructure support for mass market adoption. These statements appeared in earnings call transcripts, in press releases, and in on-record interviews with senior GM executives. They were reported without significant challenge. The internal reality was documented differently. In 2006, Rick Wagoner, who had served as GM CEO since 2000 and had overseen the final EV1 recall, told journalists directly that killing the EV1 program was the worst business decision of his tenure. That statement is on the record. But in 2001 and 2002, as the repossessions were being organized, the public position held. The official story was a business decision. The technology wasn't ready. The market wasn't there. The Bush administration, which took office in January 2001, made its own position on electric vehicle mandates explicit from the outset. In 2002, the Department of Energy restructured its advanced vehicle research priorities. Federal funding was redirected away from battery electric vehicle development and toward hydrogen fuel cell programs under the Freedom CAR initiative, a joint announcement between the DOE and the U.S. Council for Automotive Research, the lobbying consortium representing GM, Ford, and Chrysler. The DOE's own internal assessments from this period acknowledged that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles faced fundamental infrastructure and cost barriers that would prevent commercial viability before 2020 at the earliest. Hydrogen required an entirely new fueling infrastructure, something the existing petroleum network could not provide without massive capital investment. Battery electric vehicles, by contrast, could charge from existing electrical infrastructure. The internal assessments acknowledged this. The public announcement emphasized hydrogen. In April 2003, the California Air Resources Board convened to vote on restructuring the ZV mandate. The meeting record is archived and publicly accessible. CARB voted 8-0 to eliminate the specific requirement for battery electric vehicles. Automakers could now meet their zero-emission obligations through partial zero-emission vehicles, hybrids, and through credits for future fuel cell programs that existed, at that point, only as research partnerships. The vote was unanimous. The battery mandate was gone. Within weeks, GM initiated the recall of every remaining EV1 on California roads. The drivers who received the notices, many of whom had been waiting for a second-generation lease, were informed that the terms of their agreements required the vehicles to be returned. Some were offered nominal goodwill payments. Protests organized outside the GM processing facility at the Burbank Airport. Video footage exists of drivers standing next to their vehicles in the final hours before the cars were loaded. The last EV1s were processed at a crushing facility in Fontana, California. A small number, approximately 40 vehicles, were disabled and donated to museums and universities, their drivetrains rendered permanently inoperable before handover. GM cited liability concerns for working vehicles it could no longer support with parts. That was the stated rationale. The program was over. The official record said it had simply run its course. The cost of what ended in 2003 can be partially quantified. The full cost cannot. General Motors had invested approximately $1 billion in the EV1 program. That investment in battery development, manufacturing tooling, charging infrastructure, engineering and design was not sold. It was not licensed. It was written off entirely. The nickel metal hydride battery patents, now held through Chevron's Cobasys subsidiary, remained locked. Any manufacturer seeking to scale large format NiMH battery production for electric vehicles faced licensing terms structured to block commercial application. The window during which NiMH represented the best available mass-market EV battery technology was roughly 10 years to 1995 to 2005. That window was spent in legal holding patterns and regulatory battles. Toyota, which had been the other serious actor in U.S. battery EV development through the RAV4 EV program, pivoted to the Prius hybrid following the supply termination. The Prius used a smaller format NiMH pack, not subject to the blocking patents. It was commercially successful. It reduced emissions relative to a combustion vehicle. It was not a zero-emission car. The United States, which in the late 1990s held the leading position in electric vehicle development, in engineering talent, in battery research, in charging infrastructure, in regulatory framework, ceded that position entirely over the following decade. The engineers who had worked on the EV1 dispersed. The charging networks that had been installed in California were decommissioned. The manufacturing capabilities that had been built were mothballed. When Tesla began delivering the original Roadster in meaningful numbers in 2009, the starting price was $109,000. Company had rebuilt the technological foundation from scratch, not because it was necessary to do so, but because the existing development thread had been cut. The International Energy Agency estimated in its 2023 World Energy Outlook that a 15-year acceleration of EV adoption, beginning in earnest in 2005 rather than 2020, would have displaced between 2.5 and 3 million barrels of oil demand per day by 2020. At 2020, average oil prices of approximately $42 per barrel. That represents roughly $38 to $46 billion in annual foregone oil revenue, compounding across the intervening years. The Chevron patent position was eventually resolved through legal settlement in 2010. By that point, the industry had moved to lithium-ion battery chemistry, technology not covered by Chevron's NiMH patents, but which required a full additional decade of development before achieving the cost and energy density performance that NiMH technology had already demonstrated in the late 1990s. The 10-year development delay is documented. The companies responsible for it faced no regulatory accountability. The costs were borne elsewhere. In 2024, the average price of a new electric vehicle in the United States was approximately $55,000. Battery costs have fallen dramatically from over $1,000 per kilowatt hour in 2010 to under $100 per kilowatt hour by 2024, a 90% reduction. Public charging infrastructure now exists at scale. The technology is mature. The engineers who built the EV1 and worked on the RAV4 EV have, in subsequent interviews and legal depositions, described technology that was on an accelerating cost reduction trajectory in the late 1990s. The curve did not break for technical reasons. It was interrupted. The decisions made between 1999 and 2003, the Ovonic patent transfer to Texaco, the Chevron acquisition and Cobasys licensing strategy, the coordinated lobbying against the California ZV mandate, the Bush administration's redirection of federal research funding to hydrogen, the CARB vote of April 2003 did not kill the electric vehicle. They delayed it. The consensus estimate among transportation economists and EV historians is a delay of approximately 15 years. 15 years during which combustion engines continued to dominate global transportation. 15 years of tailpipe emissions that would otherwise have been displaced. 15 years during which oil consumption from personal vehicles remained at levels that would have begun declining in a normal development trajectory. The documented reason for those 15 years is not consumer preference. Survey data from the EV1 program consistently showed strong satisfaction and demonstrated demand from the consumer base that had been allowed to experience the product. The documented reason is not technological immaturity. The cars worked. The engineers said they worked. The drivers said they worked. Gene's own internal records said they worked. The documented reason is a coordinated effort funded by the oil industry, executed through lobbying contracts, patent control, legal challenges, and regulatory capture to delay the commercial transition away from liquid fuels for as long as economically possible. That effort succeeded in its immediate objective. The California Air Resources Board meeting minutes from April 2003 are publicly archived. The FEC and California Secretary of State lobbying disclosure records from this period are publicly searchable. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office filings on the Ovonic NiMH patents are public record. The Doe Freedom CAR program documentation is available under Freedom of Information. The paper trail was never hidden. It was simply never followed by the people with the largest audiences. General Motors built a car in 1996 that worked. The oil industry funded the campaign to ensure it didn't matter. The federal government provided the regulatory environment in which that campaign succeeded. In 2008, Rick Wagner stood before Congress to request a federal bailout. GM received $49.5 billion in U.S. taxpayer funds, the largest government rescue of an American corporation in history to that point. 2 years earlier, he had publicly identified the EV1 decision as the worst of his career. Chevron reported record profits in 2022, $35.5 billion in a single year. The NiMH patents that Cobasys had used to block EV development had long since expired. The company was not called to account for how those patents had been used. This is the reason your electric vehicle costs what it costs. This is the reason the charging network you use was built 15 years later than the technology warranted. This is the reason the engineers who built the first mass-market American electric car were told to hand over their keys and go home. The files show what happened. The files have always shown what happened. Most people slept through this. You didn't. Subscribe, because there's more.